Calvin Marcus Webb had spent 32 years in the United States Army, understanding that an institution is not its uniform, and that the authority of a person does not reside in what they are wearing at a given moment, but in what they have built over the years that the moment is an instance of. He had learned this, among other places, from a lieutenant colonel he had served under in his first assignment, who had told him when Calvin was 23 years old, and newly commissioned as a second lieutenant and inclined as second lieutenants are to confuse the external signals of rank with the substance of leadership. The rank is the shorthand. The substance is the record. The record is what you actually are. He had been 23 years old and had understood about 40% of what the lieutenant colonel meant. He had spent the following 43 years understanding the other 60%, and he was still at 66, finding layers in it that he had not previously seen. He was 66 years old. He had been a soldier for 32 of those years, from the summer of 1984, when he had graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point as a field artillery officer, to the fall of 2016, when he had submitted his retirement papers after a final assignment as a senior fellow at the United States Army War College, which was the institution that trained the Army's most senior leaders in strategic thinking and institutional leadership. Between those two dates, the commissioning and the retirement, he had been an artillery officer and a battalion operations officer and a brigade operations officer and a battalion commander and a brigade commander and a deputy commanding general and a senior fellow. And he had done each of those things in the specific way that the Army required of its officers, and that the record of his service documented in detail, because the Army was, among other things, the most thorough documenting institution he had ever encountered, which was a quality he respected. He had been deployed 4 times. The Gulf War in 1991 as a captain commanding a field artillery battery, the specific experience of commanding 82 soldiers in combat for the first time, the experience that had taught him in a way that no training had been able to fully anticipate, what it meant to be responsible for the lives of the people you commanded, and what it required of you to be worthy of that responsibility. Bosnia in 1996 as a lieutenant colonel at the brigade level, where he had spent 8 months navigating the specific difficulty of a peacekeeping mission in a country that was not fully at peace and that required a different kind of leadership than combat. One that demanded the same precision but applied it differently. Iraq in 2003 and again in 2007 as a colonel, commanding the 1st Brigade Combat Team in the first deployment and as a general officer in the second, where he had the specific vantage of a flag officer on the nature of large-scale operations, a vantage that changed what you could see and limited what you could directly influence, and that required the discipline to accept that limitation and to exercise the authority you had rather than the authority you had no longer needed to exercise. He had been promoted to Brigadier General in 2009, which was the rank he had held for the final 7 years of his service, and which was the rank under which his name now appeared on his business card. Calvin M. Webb, Brigadier General, USA, Retired Senior Director, Meridian Defense Partners. The business card was the standard format for senior retired officers who moved into the Civilian Defense Advisory Sector Rank Service Branch abbreviation, indicating retired status, current title. It was a professional credential. It communicated accurately. He carried it in his wallet with the same care he had carried his identification for 32 years of service. The promotion to general officer had been in his own assessment, the transition in his career that required the most significant adjustment, not because the responsibilities were unfamiliar, because by 2009 he had been preparing for and growing into increasing responsibility for 25 years, but because the nature of the authority changed at the general officer level in a way that it did not change at the lower officer ranks. As a colonel commanding a brigade, he had been close enough to the soldiers to see their faces and to know their names, and to be directly accountable to them for the quality of his leadership in a way that was immediate and personal. As a general officer, the relationship between his decisions and the soldiers who experienced the consequences of those decisions was mediated by a chain of command that put distance between the decision and its effect, and that distance required a different discipline. The discipline of being fully accountable for decisions whose effects you could not directly observe, and of relying on the NCOs and officers in your chain of command to be the connection between your intent and the execution, which meant your judgment of people had to be sound, because your judgment of people was the mechanism by which your intent became action. He had done the work. He had spent his career doing the work at every level in the specific way that each level required. He had asked from the people who served under him exactly what he asked from himself, which was the precise, documented, accountable execution of the mission with the courage to report failures accurately and the discipline to correct them specifically. He had not always gotten this from everyone. He had gotten it from enough people that the missions had succeeded, and from the exceptions he had learned the specific limits of what leadership can produce and what it cannot overcome. He had filed those limits as knowledge and applied the knowledge in his subsequent work. He was still applying it. Meridian Defense Partners was a defense strategy consulting firm that worked with government agencies, defense contractors, and allied military organizations on strategic planning, leadership development, acquisition strategy, and organizational design. Calvin had joined the firm 4 months after his retirement, because 4 months after 32 years of structured purpose, he had understood that he was not a person built for purposelessness, and that the work he had done in the Army strategic planning, leadership development, institutional assessment translated directly into civilian application, and that there were institutions and organizations that needed what he knew how to do. He was one of 12 senior directors at the firm, all of them retired general or flag officers from the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine Corps. They were the people their clients called when they needed to think clearly about complex institutional problems, and they had spent their careers building the capacity to help with that kind of thinking. He was in the city for the National Defense Strategy Conference, which was an annual gathering of retired senior military officers, defense industry executives, Department of Defense, civilian officials, and active duty flag officers to discuss the strategic landscape and the defense policy questions that the landscape was producing. Calvin had attended this conference for 4 years since his retirement. He stayed each time at the Calloway Grand, which was the conference's host hotel, a 5-star property at the center of the city that had been hosting the conference for 12 of its 16 years, that had the meeting facilities and the room block that the conference required, and that had over 12 years of hosting developed the specific relationship with conference participants that made the logistics of a large multi-day gathering run correctly. Calvin had a reservation. He had had a reservation for this conference at this hotel for the past 4 years. His name was in the system. He arrived on the Sunday evening before the conference's Monday opening, which was his practice, arriving the evening before, getting settled, reviewing the conference program, and sleeping well before the first full day. He had learned the value of the pre-conference evening in 22 years of attending operational and strategic planning conferences for the Army, in which arriving the evening before was the difference between entering the first session oriented and focused and entering it still managing the logistics of arrival. He was 66 years old, and he had been optimizing his conference arrival protocols since he was 44, and the evening before arrival was one of the protocols that had been stable for the longest time. He parked in the hotel's adjacent garage and walked across the covered walkway to the hotel's side entrance, which he preferred to the main entrance on conference arrival evenings, because the side entrance led directly to the lobby corridor, rather than through the main entrance hall, which was the longer path. He was carrying a rolling suitcase and a garment bag over his shoulder, the specific combination of a traveler who has done this trip many times and who knows exactly what he needs and how to carry it. He was wearing dark trousers and a light blue dress shirt with his suit jacket folded over the arm that carried the garment bag. He had driven from his home 2 hours away and had been in the car for 2 hours and had removed the jacket in the car because he drove in a shirt when the drive was 2 hours. He intended to put the jacket on before he reached the front desk, which was his habit. He had always preferred to be properly dressed when he checked into a hotel, and properly dressed for a 5-star hotel meant jacket on. He had not yet reached the front desk. He had in 32 years of Army service and 6 years of defense consulting traveled enough to have strong and tested preferences about the mechanics of travel preferences that were not arbitrary, but had been developed through the specific experience of doing something hundreds of times and identifying what worked and what created friction. He preferred arriving the evening before a conference because it gave him 11 hours to settle and sleep and orient before the first session. He preferred rolling suitcase over checked luggage because checked luggage added 40 minutes to the departure process, and 40 minutes was the interval between 2 useful conversations at a conference, and conversations were work. He preferred the side entrance at the Calloway Grand because it put him in the lobby corridor rather than the main entrance hall and gave him a direct line to the front desk. He had arrived at the Calloway Grand 4 times. The side entrance had worked 4 times. He had no reason to change what worked. He also had, in 32 years and 6 years of post-service travel, a clear and documented understanding of what happened sometimes when he entered public spaces in civilian clothes. An understanding that was grounded in specific incidents that he had not experienced at the same rate when he was in uniform, and that he experienced at a higher rate when he was not. He had been a large black man in civilian clothes in public spaces for 66 years, which was a longer tenure in that condition than his military service, and the incidents that condition had produced were not limited to any single period of his life or any single domain of his experience. He had been stopped in airports and in lobbies and in parking garages and in stores, and once memorably in the parking lot of the Pentagon, which was the building in which he had been working at the time, by a guard who had not recognized him out of uniform. He had, in each instance, identified himself and produced his credentials and proceeded. He had, in each instance, documented the incident in the form of a note in the relevant notebook, the specifics, the time, the result, the credential that had resolved it. He had not filed formal complaints in all cases. He had documented all cases. The documentation was a practice, and he was a person who maintained his practices. He had thought about these incidents over the years, with the same combination of analysis and equanimity that he applied to the operational problems he was paid to analyze. The analysis was: the assessment was made before the evidence. The credential resolved it. The record says what it says. The equanimity was the work requires full function, and full function requires that you not be consumed by incidents that are outside your control, because the consumption would be a concession to the incident, and he was not in the habit of conceding things he did not have to concede. He had maintained his full function for 66 years. He intended to maintain it for the years remaining. The lobby of the Calloway Grand at 7:20 on a Sunday evening had the particular quality of a 5-star hotel in the last hours of the weekend. Business travelers arriving a Sunday evening wedding reception in the ballroom off the main corridor, producing a controlled current of formally dressed guests moving between the ballroom and the bar. The concierge desk, quiet in the way that concierge desks are quiet on Sunday evenings when the week's arrivals have not yet fully come in and the weekend's departures have largely been processed. The lobby was large, high ceilings, a marble floor, the particular sound quality of a well-appointed large room that is neither loud nor silent, but which has a specific acoustic presence. He knew this lobby. He had walked through it on 4 prior conference arrivals. He was moving from the side entrance toward the front desk, which was across the lobby from the side entrance and which required him to cross approximately 40 feet of lobby floor. He had covered about 15 of those 40 feet when Jordan Kessler intercepted him. Jordan Kessler was 23 years old and had been working as a hotel security officer at the Calloway Grand for 6 months. He was in his hotel security uniform, a dark blazer with the Calloway Grand logo at the lapel, dress, trousers, and earpiece. He had been on the lobby floor for 90 minutes of a 4-hour shift and had been doing the kind of ambient assessment that hotel lobby security required, watching who was coming in, watching whether they were going where guests and visitors go, watching for the specific behaviors that indicated someone who did not belong in the space. He was young, and he was new, and he had the specific limitation of new lobby security officers, which was that the pattern of who belongs and who does not belong was assembled from a small sample of experience and was therefore less calibrated than the pattern that 10 or 15 years of lobby security would produce. He looked at Calvin Webb, the dress shirt without a jacket, the 2 pieces of luggage, the side entrance rather than the main, and he made an assessment. He moved to intercept. He said, "Sir, can I help you with something?" Calvin stopped. He looked at the security officer. He assessed the interaction in the time it took to turn and look young lobby security, the specific body language of someone who has not yet decided what this interaction is going to require. He said, "I'm checking in. I have a reservation." Kessler said, "Do you have your reservation information?" Calvin said, "I do. It's in the system. The reservation is under my name, Webb. I'm going to the front desk to check in." Kessler said, "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to wait here for a moment." Calvin said, "I'm happy to speak with you, but I'd like to continue to the front desk while we talk. I've been in the car for 2 hours and I'd like to check in." Kessler said, "Sir, the hotel has a policy about..." He paused in the way of someone who is trying to phrase something carefully and has not decided how to phrase it. Calvin said, "About what?" Kessler said, "About verifying guests before they access the lobby." Calvin said, "I am in the lobby. I came in through the side entrance, which is an entrance I have used 4 times. I am a hotel guest with a reservation. I am walking to the front desk to check in. I am not accessing the lobby. I have been in the lobby for approximately 30 seconds. He said it without heat in the specific register of a man who has spent 32 years communicating in situations that required clarity, and who has learned that clarity is not the same thing as volume, and that the most precisely stated information arrives with the least embellishment. He said it, and he waited for the information to do its work. Kessler said, "Sir, I need to see some identification." Calvin reached into the pocket of the garment bag and produced his wallet. He opened it to his driver's license. He held it out. Kessler looked at it. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the driver's license again. He said, "Do you have your reservation confirmation number?" Calvin said, "It's in the system under my name. The front desk has it. That is the standard process." Kessler said, "I'm going to need to verify that before you proceed." Calvin looked at him for a moment. He thought about 32 years in the United States Army, about 32 years of institutions and their protocols, and the specific failure mode that occurs when an institution's protocol is applied without the judgment that the protocol is designed to support when the form of the protocol takes the place of its function. He had seen this failure mode in military contexts and in civilian contexts and in institutions of every kind. He had spent significant portions of his career addressing it. He recognized it now in the lobby of the Calloway Grand at 7:20 on a Sunday evening in the form of a 23-year-old security officer who had looked at him and had applied a pattern that the evidence did not support, and who was now enforcing a protocol in a way that the protocol had not been designed to support. He said, "Of course." He said it without edge because edge was not useful in situations that required information to move efficiently. He said, "The front desk will verify it in under 30 seconds. I am asking you to walk with me to the front desk and let the front desk verify it. That is the appropriate channel for reservation verification, and it is 40 feet from where we are standing." Claire Song had been watching the interaction from the front desk. She was 34 years old and had been with the Calloway Grand for 6 years and had been the front desk manager for 3. She knew how to read a lobby interaction from across the marble floor, and she had read this one in its first 20 seconds, and she had understood what she was looking at. She came out from behind the front desk and crossed the lobby. She said, "Sir, I'm Claire Song, front desk manager. May I help you check in?" Calvin said, "Thank you. My name is Calvin Webb. I have a reservation." She turned to the terminal at the side of the front desk station she had walked to. She typed his name. She looked at the reservation. She said, "Mr. Webb, of course. I have your reservation here. You're in Suite 714, our standard conference suite for returning conference participants. You've been with us 3 years running." She looked up at him. She said, "Welcome back." He said, "Thank you." Robert Hartley had seen the interaction from the far side of the lobby. He was 52 years old and had been the general manager of the Calloway Grand for 6 of his 18 years in hotel management. He had come to hotel management from 22 years in the United States Army, where he had served as a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant major, which was the highest non-commissioned officer rank in the Army's structure, and had retired in 2004 with a record of service that was in its own domain as thorough and as documented as Calvin Webb's, which was the comparison Bobby Hartley would have made if you had asked him about records of service, because he understood what a record of service meant in the way that you understand something you have lived for 22 years. He had grown up in Ohio, the second of 4 children of a factory worker and a hospital administrator, and had enlisted in the Army at 18 because a recruiter had come to his high school and had said things that had proven over 22 years of subsequent service to be largely accurate. He had been a field artillery soldier, which was the branch that had connected him eventually with the brigade structure in which he had made sergeant major. He had known from his 6th year of service that he was going to be a sergeant major, had known it the way you know things that are grounded in evidence rather than in aspiration from the evaluations he received and the assignments he was selected for, and the judgment of the senior NCOs who had assessed him over the years. The Army told you through the pattern of your assignments and the content of your evaluations what it thought you were capable of. And what the Army thought Bobby Hartley was capable of was evidenced by the fact that he had been selected as a command sergeant major, the top enlisted leadership position in a brigade-level command, and that the brigade he had been assigned to had been one of the Army's most consequential deploying brigades in 2003. He had served in the 1st Brigade Combat Team in 2003. He had been the brigade command sergeant major for the final 18 months of the deployment, the senior enlisted advisor to the brigade commander, the person who stood between the commander's intent and the execution of that intent at the soldier level, the person who knew what the soldiers were experiencing and who communicated that knowledge to the commander and who communicated the commander's intent to the soldiers. The brigade commander he had served under in 2003 had been Colonel Calvin Marcus Webb. Bobby Hartley had in his 22 years of service worked for 11 different commanders, ranging from competent to exceptional, with one who had been below competent and who had been relieved in Bobby's 3rd year by a superior who had seen what Bobby had been managing for 6 months and had made the correct decision. Calvin Webb had been in Bobby's assessment, an assessment built on 22 years of data points about what commanders were in the top 2 of the 11. Not the best, because the best had been a battalion commander in Bobby's 8th year, who had a quality of attention to people that Bobby had not seen before or since. But top 2, which in 22 years of service was a distinction that meant something. Colonel Webb had known what he knew, had asked for what he didn't know, had listened when he was told what he didn't know, had been direct about his expectations, and consistent about his standards, and honest about failures, in a way that failures are easy to hide when you are in command if you are willing to paper over them. He had not been willing to paper over them. He had acknowledged them, assessed them, corrected them, moved. Bobby had stayed in touch as much as the Army's movement patterns allowed for the years after the 2003 deployment. He had heard when Calvin had made general officer. He had sent a note. The note had been acknowledged with a brief handwritten reply that was in the form of all of Calvin Webb's communications, specific direct saying what it meant to say in the number of words the meaning required. Bobby had kept the note. He had recognized the name on the conference guest list when the Calloway Grand had confirmed the conference contract 2 months ago. He had noted when the room block allocations had come through that Calvin Webb was on the list. He had thought, when he noted it, I'll see him at check-in. He had not expected to see him in the middle of a lobby interaction that his security officer had initiated. He crossed the lobby with the specific pace of someone who has 22 years of experience crossing ground quickly, and who is crossing it now with a purpose. He reached the front desk where Calvin was standing with Claire Song. He said, "General Webb." Calvin turned. He looked at Robert Hartley. He assessed the posture, the bearing, the specific quality of standing that you build in 22 years of military service, and that does not leave you when you leave the service the hotel general manager's uniform that was wearing the frame of a soldier. He placed the face in about 3 seconds. He said, "Bobby Hartley." Bobby Hartley said, "Yes, sir." He did not salute. This was a civilian lobby, and Calvin was in civilian clothes, and the salute was the form the military used. And this was not a military setting, but the respect in his posture was unmistakable. It was the respect of someone who had stood next to a commander in a combat deployment and who carried that proximity in his body in a way that proximity of that kind leaves a physical residue. He said, "It's good to see you, sir. I'm sorry for any difficulty at the entrance." Calvin said, "It's good to see you, Bobby." He said it and meant it. Bobby Hartley had been one of the most capable non-commissioned officers he had served with in 32 years. He had served with him in 2003 and had watched him manage the human complexity of a brigade in a combat deployment with the specific skill of an NCO who has been doing this for 15 years. And who understands what soldiers need in ways that officers, by the nature of the officer-NCO divide, cannot always fully see. He had written Bobby's retirement evaluation himself, which was not a standard practice for a general officer, but which he had done because the evaluation needed to be specific, and he was the person who could make it specific. He said, "I hear you're running this hotel." Bobby said, "Going on 6 years, sir." He said, "The conference has been coming here for 4 years. Your reservation is confirmed. Suite 714. He looked at Kessler, who was standing at a slight distance with the posture of someone who understands that the situation has developed in a direction he had not foreseen. He said, "Jordan, I'll introduce you to General Webb when we're through with the check-in." He said it without heat or reproach. He said it the way a good non-commissioned officer addresses a junior enlisted who has made an error that needs to be corrected with specificity and without punishment, because the specificity is the mechanism of correction, and the punishment is not. Calvin checked in. Claire Song processed the room key and the conference registration in 4 minutes. Bobby Hartley walked him to the elevator. They spoke for 3 minutes in the lobby near the elevator bank. The kind of conversation that two people who have not seen each other in years and who share a significant shared experience have when they find themselves unexpectedly in the same lobby. They asked about each other's families. They mentioned names of people they had both known. They made a loose plan to have coffee during a conference break. Calvin said, "Bobby, your hotel is running well. I've been here 4 years and it gets better." Bobby said, "We try, sir." He said, "We've got good people." Then the elevator arrived. Calvin said, "Good night, Bobby." Bobby said, "Good night, sir. Good to have you here." Calvin went upstairs. He hung the garment bag in the closet, a cedar-lined closet that was the specific quality of a well-appointed hotel closet, wide enough for a garment bag and a rolling suitcase, and the shoes he had been wearing on the drive, which he changed now to the shoes he wore to dinner. He put the rolling suitcase on the luggage rack. He took out the suit jacket and hung it beside the garment bag. He changed his shirt because the shirt he had been wearing since morning was the shirt he had been driving in, and the shirt he would wear to dinner was not the same shirt. He put on the jacket over the fresh shirt. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. 66 years old, the specific posture of someone who has stood straight since West Point, and who has not stopped standing straight in the 43 years since the face that bore the record of those 43 years. the silver at his temples, and the particular lines that 3 deployments and 32 years of sustained responsibility leave in the face of a person who has taken the responsibility seriously. He thought about the lobby. He thought about Jordan Kessler, 23 6 months in hotel security, working with the pattern recognition of a person with a small sample and a conclusion drawn before the evidence. He thought about what Bobby Hartley had said. "I'll introduce you to General Webb when we're through with the check-in." The correction without punishment. The teaching and the phrasing. Bobby Hartley had spent 22 years learning how to teach that way, which was the most efficient way, the kind of teaching that informs without humiliating, that identifies the error without making the person feel that the error defines them. Because a person who feels defined by their error is a person who cannot fully receive the correction. Bobby had understood this for 22 years. He was using it in a hotel lobby, the skills transferred. Calvin had spent significant portions of his career thinking about what transferred and what did not. The question was one of the central questions of the leadership seminars he ran at Meridian, because the clients who hired Meridian were organizations, government agencies, defense contractors, allied militaries that were trying to build the kind of institutional capacity that the military had spent 250 years building, and that could not simply be installed through policy or training, but had to be grown through practice and correction and time. He told them the skills transfer. The conditions that produce the skills are harder to replicate than the skills themselves, which means you have to build the conditions deliberately, rather than assuming they will develop on their own. The conditions are clear standards, accurate assessment, honest correction, sufficient time. Without all 4, the skills develop unevenly, which means the institution performs unevenly, which means the institution fails when the performance of a few people is not enough to compensate for the gaps in the performance of many. He had been running the seminar for 2 years. The clients who came back were the clients who had understood what he was saying. The clients who did not come back had usually understood it at the level of the phrase, and not at the level of the mechanism. And the phrase without the mechanism was not enough to change an institution, which was a lesson he had learned in his own career at the unit level and the division level and the Army War College level, and which he applied to each of his civilian clients with the specific patience of someone who has learned that the lesson takes as long as it takes and cannot be rushed without being distorted. He put the jacket on in the room, the fresh shirt, the jacket, the shoes he traveled in and wore to dinner, rather than the athletic shoes he wore for driving, because the shoes were the kind of preparation you made before you went into a public space, and he had been making that preparation for 32 years, and he was not going to stop now. He looked in the mirror. He thought 66 years old, still standing. He went to dinner. He thought about being 23 himself, which was the age he had been when he first arrived at his first assignment at Fort Bragg as a brand new second lieutenant, knowing nothing useful and confident in the way that second lieutenants are confident before they understand how much they do not know. He had been wrong about many things in his first year. He had been corrected specifically and professionally by people who understood their obligation to correct him. He had listened because he had been told at West Point that listening to correction was the primary professional obligation of a junior officer, and he had believed it, and the believing had proven correct over 43 subsequent years. The first correction he remembered specifically, the first one that had the quality of a lesson rather than a reprimand, had come from a master sergeant named Delgado in his first battery command, a man who had been in the Army for 16 years when Calvin arrived, and who had the specific combination of precision and patience that the best NCOs develop over years of being responsible for both the mission and the soldiers who execute it. Delgado had pulled him aside after a training exercise in which Calvin had briefed the battery with a fire mission sequence that was technically correct, but which he had delivered in a way that 3 soldiers had found unclear and which had produced a 6-second delay in the execution at a moment when 6 seconds was the difference between on time and late. Delgado had said, "Sir, your sequence was right. The way you said it was not clear to Jones and Martinez and Tran. Here is why. He had then described specifically what the three soldiers had heard and why they had heard it differently from what Calvin had meant, and had suggested 3 specific modifications to the briefing format that would produce clarity for those 3 soldiers without reducing clarity for the others. Calvin had implemented the modifications. He had never had a 6-second delay from a briefing problem again. He had sent a note to Delgado when Delgado retired 15 years later. He had not expected Delgado to remember the incident from 15 years prior. The note had said, "You taught me something important in my first year that I have been applying every year since. I wanted you to know it." Delgado had written back, "That is what the job is for, sir." He had kept the note. He had been told other things by his father, who had been a public high school principal for 26 years in the city where Calvin had grown up. A man who had run the same school for most of those 26 years. And who had built the specific knowledge of an institution that comes from being inside it for decades, from knowing its rhythms and its people and its failures, and its capacity for correction. His father had told him, institutions fail their people regularly. Your job is not to be destroyed by the failure. Your job is to be still standing after it with the record intact. He had been 12 years old when his father had said this. He had understood it then as an abstract principle, and he had understood it since as a practical operational reality that he had confirmed in 32 years of service and 6 years of post-service work. The record was intact. He was still standing. The lobby of the Calloway Grand was 40 feet of marble floor, and he had crossed it, and he was in Suite 714, and the conference started tomorrow at 8 in the morning. His father had been Edward Marcus Webb, a man who had spent 26 years as an educator, first as a teacher for 6 years, then as an assistant principal for 4, then as the principal of Carver High School for the 16 years after that. He had run Carver High School through 3 superintendents, 2 major curriculum revisions, 1 physical renovation, and the specific social pressures of 16 years in a city that was changing around the school in ways that the school had to accommodate without losing the thing that made it a school, which was its function as a place where young people came to learn, and the learning took. Edward Webb had not always agreed with the decisions made by the superintendents. He had made his disagreements known through the channels available to him, the formal channels, and the informal ones, the written channels and the conversational ones, and had accepted the decisions that were made and had implemented them to the best of the school's ability, and had held his staff accountable for implementation in the same way he held them accountable for everything, clearly specifically, without punishment for honest effort, with consequences for dishonest effort. He had told Calvin when Calvin was applying to West Point and was asking for advice on what the military was actually like. It is an institution, which means it is not as good as it could be. Your job is to be in it and be better than it needs you to be, which will pull the institution in the direction it needs to go. He had said this is true of every institution. He had said the ones that survive are the ones with enough people who are better than the institution needs them to be. Calvin had kept this as a working theory for 43 years, and it had been confirmed in his experience more often than it had been refuted, which was not the same as saying it was always true, but which was saying it was useful, and useful was the standard he applied to working theories. He went to dinner. The Calloway Grand had a restaurant on the ground floor, a well-regarded dining room that he had eaten in on 2 prior conference visits. And he went there and ate alone at a table by the window because eating alone was not something he had ever found uncomfortable, which was a function of many years of deployments, in which eating alone had been a necessity, and in which the necessity had become, over time, a form of useful quiet. He ordered the fish, which was what he ordered when he did not have a particular preference, because fish prepared correctly at a 5-star hotel was reliable in a way that steak was not, and he preferred reliability. He ate, and he looked at the window, and he thought about the conference program. which he had reviewed in the car on the drive down, and which had 2 sessions in the first day that were of specific interest to him, a morning session on AI integration in defense planning, and an afternoon session on strategic workforce development, both of which touched areas where Meridian was doing active advisory work and where the conference discussion would be useful for the work. He had been thinking about the AI integration question for 8 months, since a client, a defense contractor working on autonomous systems acquisition, had brought Meridian in to help assess the organizational implications of integrating AI-assisted decision support into operational planning. The question was not primarily a technology question, which was the framing the client had arrived with. It was a leadership question: what changes when human decision-makers have AI-generated recommendations available at the point of decision, and how do you build organizations that use those recommendations without becoming dependent on them in ways that degrade the core human decision-making capacity that the recommendations are supposed to support. He had been working on this with 3 Meridian colleagues and had developed a framework that he was testing with clients, and that the morning session at the conference would give him an opportunity to test against the thinking of people who had been working on the same problem from different angles. He liked testing his frameworks against people who disagreed. The disagreement was the mechanism of improvement. He ate his dinner and drank 1 glass of wine and reviewed his notes for the morning session, which he had been developing in the car, and which he had written when he reached a red light on the highway, into the leather notebook he kept in the jacket pocket. The notes were 3 specific questions he intended to raise in the session's open discussion period, framed in the form that he found most productive for conference discussions, not assertions that invited argument, but questions that invited the kind of response that revealed what the responder actually thought, rather than what they thought they were supposed to think. He had learned this framing at the Army War College, where the seminar method was the primary pedagogical tool, and where the quality of questions was more important than the quantity of positions, because a well-formed question produced more useful information than a well-argued position. He used it everywhere now. He ordered coffee after dinner and took out the small leather notebook he carried in his jacket pocket. Not a working notebook, but a reading notebook. The notebook he used for the observations that occurred to him when he was sitting alone and thinking, which were often the observations that later proved useful in work contexts. He wrote 3 sentences about the lobby interaction because 3 sentences was enough to capture the essential elements, and he intended to use it in the leadership seminar he was running for Meridian's clients. In the following month, a seminar on institutional pattern recognition and the specific failure mode that occurs when pattern recognition is executed without the judgment that its accuracy requires. The 3 sentences were precise. They captured the essential elements without embellishing them. He had learned precision in notebooks from his father, who had kept notebooks throughout his 26 years as a principal, notebooks that were not diaries and not journals, but operational records, the entries organized by problem and response and outcome, rather than by date and feeling. Edward Webb had told Calvin when Calvin was 16 and asking how his father managed to keep track of everything you write down, what happened and what you did and what came of it. That is the record. If you write down what happened and what you felt about it, you have a record of your feelings, which is a different document with a different use. He had said the record of what happened is the document that is useful when you need to decide what to do next. He had said, keep them separate. Calvin had kept them separate for 43 years. The notebook in his jacket pocket was the record of what happened. His interior account of how he felt about it was his own, and was separate and was complete and was not in the notebook. Both documents existed. He maintained both. The notebook was the one that would be in the seminar. He thought about his father's notebooks, 12 volumes kept in a cabinet in the house that his mother still lived in, covering 26 years of Carver High School in the precise, organized handwriting that Edward Webb had developed through 26 years of institutional documentation. Calvin had read 6 of them after his father's death, looking for the pattern, looking for the way his father had seen institutions and what his father had concluded about them over a quarter-century. The pattern was there. The pattern said, institutions are composed of people who are better and worse than the institution needs them to be, and the job is to grow more of the better and address the worse and be patient with the time this requires. He thought, yes, that is what the job is. He thought it took 26 years of notebooks to say it that clearly, which means the clarity was itself an outcome of the practice. He closed the notebook. He drank his coffee. He put the notebook away. He drank his coffee. He looked at the window which showed the street outside the Calloway Grand, the Sunday evening city street, with its specific quality of a large city's downtown. On a Sunday night, the restaurants and the taxis and the people moving in groups and alone, the particular light of a city that never goes fully dark, but that on Sunday nights has a quality of settling that is different from Friday and Saturday, a lower frequency, the city coming down from the weekend toward the week. He thought about Bobby Hartley, who had served 22 years and was now running a 5-star hotel, and who had been, by every indication Calvin had gathered in a 3-minute lobby conversation, exactly as good at his current role as he had been at his military role. The skills transferred. He had said this many times in his Meridian seminars. Bobby Hartley was evidence. He went upstairs at 9:15. He reviewed the first conference session's agenda one more time. He set his alarm for 6:15 on the clock beside the bed. He was 66 years old, and he had been waking reliably at 6:15 for 32 years, and the alarm was a formality, but the formality was a practice, and he maintained his practices, because the practices were the infrastructure of his professional function, and he had never let his function decline below its standard, and he was not starting now. The following morning, Robert Hartley met him in the conference registration area before the 8 o'clock opening session. He had Jordan Kessler with him, the young security officer, in his hotel blazer, standing with the specific posture of someone who is about to be introduced to a person whose significance has become clearer since they last saw each other. Bobby said, "General Webb, I'd like to introduce Jordan Kessler. Jordan joined our security team 6 months ago. Jordan General Webb retired from the Army as a Brigadier General after 32 years of service. He commanded the 1st Brigade Combat Team in 2003. He's been a conference participant here for 4 years. He's one of our guests." Calvin looked at Jordan Kessler. Kessler was looking at him with the expression of someone who has processed additional information and who is doing the recalibration that the additional information requires. He was 23, and he had made an error, and he was standing in a conference registration area at 7:51 in the morning, being introduced to the person the error had been made on, and the person was 66 years old and was a brigadier general who had commanded a brigade in combat, and was being introduced to him by a man who had clearly served under him and who was the general manager of the hotel that Jordan worked for. The recalibration was substantial. Jordan was doing it in real time. Calvin said, "Jordan," he said, "you did your job last night. The channel you were using was the wrong channel for the situation, but you were doing your job." He said it with the specific precision that he had learned in 32 years of developing people, not minimizing the error, not overstating it, identifying it clearly, and placing it in the context of the professional practice that the correction was meant to improve. He said, "Bobby is going to work with you on calibrating that assessment. You're going to be good at this." He meant the last sentence. He had assessed Jordan Kessler's handling of the previous evening's interaction, the fact that he had not escalated beyond the initial approach, that he had accepted the driver's license when Calvin produced it, and had not demanded something further, that he had been respectful in his address throughout, and had concluded that the error was an error of calibration, not of character, which was the kind of error that was correctable. Character errors were not uncorrectable, but they were harder because they required the person to want to change something that was part of how they understood themselves. Calibration errors required the person to want to improve something that they had already identified as a skill, which was easier because most people who are trying to do their job well want to do it better when they understand what better looks like. He had seen Bobby Hartley look at Kessler during the introduction with the specific attention of a supervisor who has already identified the training opportunity and is preparing to use it. He thought Kessler was in good hands. Kessler said, "Yes, sir." He said it with the automatic address of someone who has just been spoken to by a person whose authority has registered, at a deep level, the address that fills a gap when the correct address is not yet established. But the need for some form of respectful address is acute. Calvin said, "Bobby." He looked at Bobby Hartley. He said, "Good hotel." Bobby said, "Sir." He said it with the complete economy of a man who has said everything he needs to say in one word. He had learned that economy in 22 years. Some things transfer. The conference ran for 3 days. Calvin attended both sessions he had identified as relevant, contributed to a working group on strategic workforce development on the second day, had coffee with Admiral James Rollins, his closest peer from the Army War college years, and had 3 conversations with DoD civilian officials that generated specific advisory opportunities for Meridian. He ate dinner on Monday and Tuesday evenings with groups of conference participants because dinners at conferences were professional work, and the work was in the conversations, and he was there to work. He drank coffee in the conference lounge in the mornings, and he was in his suite by 10 each night because the early alarm and the full schedule required the sleep, and he had always been practical about sleep. Admiral James Rollins had been a naval officer for 34 years, and had commanded at every level from ship to fleet, and had retired in 2015 as a vice admiral, which was the Navy's equivalent in seniority to Calvin's general officer rank. He and Calvin had met at the Army War College when both were assigned to the Strategic Studies faculty in 2013 and 2014. Rollins on detail from the Navy, Calvin in the final stage of his career, and had discovered in 2 years of teaching side by side that their approaches to strategic thinking were more similar than their branch differences would have predicted. Both of them organized problems from the consequences backward rather than from the resources forward. Both of them had a specific intolerance for planning that identified constraints as permanent rather than as conditions to be managed. Both of them had seen in their careers what happened when institutions planned for the world they wanted rather than the world that existed. And both of them communicated this lesson in their respective ways to the students who came through the War College. They had coffee in the lounge on Monday afternoon between the AI session and the workforce development session, and they talked for 50 minutes about the AI integration question, and about a paper Rollins had written the previous spring on fleet autonomy and human decision-making at sea, which had generated more attention than either of them had expected, and about Meridian's work on the organizational implications question, and about 3 other things that were not conference-related, but that were the kind of conversation 2 people have when they have not seen each other in 4 months and have things to say to each other that are not about work. Calvin had known Rollins for 11 years. He expected to know him for 20 more. The conversation was the substance of a professional friendship that had been built on the same foundation as the professional relationships in the Army, shared standards, honest assessment, the willingness to tell the other person when they are wrong, which in both cases was rare and was received when it happened as the highest form of respect. On the 3rd morning, he checked out of Suite 714, which was the suite he intended to request at next year's conference because it was a well-configured suite for conference attendance. A desk large enough for working files, a view of the street that was interesting without being noisy, a bathroom with a shower that had adequate pressure, which was a quality he had come to appreciate deeply after 32 years of field showers and deployments in which adequate pressure had been a concept rather than a reality. He said goodbye to Claire Song at the front desk. He said, "Please tell Bobby I said it was a good conference." She said, "I will, sir." He said, "You handled the check-in correctly the other evening." "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment and said, "I just pulled up the reservation." He said that is exactly what the situation required. He said it with the specific precision of someone who knows the difference between a compliment and a professional assessment and who is giving the second. She thanked him. He walked through the lobby. The lobby at 9 on a Wednesday morning had a different quality from the lobby at 7:20 on a Sunday evening. Lighter, the conference attendees moving in groups toward the exit with their suitcases. The concierge desk active, the morning sun coming through the main entrance windows at an angle that made the marble floor specific and clear, in a way the evening's interior lighting did not. He crossed the marble floor. He took the covered walkway to the parking garage. He loaded the rolling suitcase and the garment bag into the car. He drove 2 hours home. He wrote a leadership seminar section on the drive, which he did not commit to the notebook while driving, but composed in his mind in the specific way he had been composing things in his mind for 43 years, building the structure of an argument, the way you build the structure of an operational order, from the situation to the mission, to the execution, to the service and support, and which he would write down when he reached his desk. The section was about pattern recognition and calibration, which was the mechanism of the lobby interaction, and which was also the mechanism of many of the institutional failures he had observed and addressed in 32 years. He thought the pattern is a tool. The tool is only as useful as the calibration. The calibration requires experience and examination and correction. The correction requires someone who will provide it specifically and without punishment. He thought Bobby Hartley understood that. He thought Jordan Kessler may yet become someone who understands it. The specific quality he had always looked for in the people he developed and the institutions he assessed was the capacity to receive correction without allowing the correction to become the story of your capability. The people who could not separate the two, who experienced every correction as evidence of fundamental inadequacy, rather than as specific information about a specific gap, were the people who improved slowly or not at all, because the defensive response that the correction triggered consumed the energy that the improvement required. The people who could separate them, who received correction as data and processed data the way you process all data by asking what it means and what you do next, were the people who improved at the rate the institution needed. He had tried for 32 years to develop more of the second kind. He had succeeded in some cases and not in others. The ratio of success to failure had improved over the years as he had gotten better at the selection of who to invest in and the method of investment, which suggested that his own calibration on the question of developing people had itself improved through the mechanism he was describing. He thought about all of this on the highway, and he drove correctly. Hands at 10 and 2, speed at 5 miles per hour over the limit, which was the speed that the highway moved and the speed that was safe in the context of what the highway was doing, and the seminar section took shape in his mind with the structure of something that had been developing for months and was now organizing itself into its final form, which happened on long drives when the mind had the specific kind of uninterrupted attention that is difficult to achieve at a desk. He had done some of his best thinking on highways. He had learned to trust what arrived on highways and to write it down when he reached a desk. He drove. The highway moved under the car. The record was intact. He had the conference notes and the 3 Meridian opportunities and the coffee with Rollins and the working group contribution, and the 3 sentences in the notebook and the seminar section taking shape in his mind, and the memory of Bobby Hartley saying, "I'll introduce you to General Webb when we're through with the check-in," which was the kind of sentence that would be in the seminar section by the time he reached his desk, because it was the most precise illustration of the principle he had encountered in months, which was the principle that the correction and the introduction can happen in the same sentence, and that the person who knows how to put them both in the same sentence has understood something important about how people improve. Bobby Hartley had learned it in 22 years. Calvin had learned it in 32. The learning was the thing that made the years worth counting. He thought about the lobby one more time, the marble floor, the 40 feet, the rolling suitcase and the garment bag and the dress shirt without the jacket, and the 23-year-old with 6 months of experience making an assessment before he had the evidence. And then standing in a conference registration area the next morning doing the recalibration in real time. He thought that is the job, not the lobby, the morning after the lobby. He drove toward home carefully. He drove toward home, which was where his desk was and his files, and the next piece of work, which was always waiting. He had been building toward work like this for 32 years. The work was still there. He was still equal to it. The record said so, and the record said what the record said. He drove. Subscribe our channel. We find the record and we read what it says.